Between 1 and 7 minutes, you can offer and take POIs. At 8 minutes, we please ask you to wrap up your speech. We are live, so I invite up the first speaker of the affirmative team to open the team's case.
For a First Nations community, what they need is not a one-off cash payment. When historical injustices have led to inequality that has shaped their lives for hundreds and hundreds of years, they need a government that actually supports them, actually addresses their issues in the here and now, that actually deals with the way that the society currently functions, allows them to integrate, allows them to thrive. What do we support in today's debate? Well, we support focusing all reparation and social security funding and support on rectifying current issues in our society. We think when we focus on these issues, not only do we solve the flow-on effect of historical injustices, we also pick up people who have fallen through the cracks of social security for other reasons. We acknowledge historical injustices, we're not hiding them under the rug, but we think that we best solve these issues and their effects when we're able to deal with them directly. Examples of this, what this looks like, will be integrated throughout my speech. 3 points in today's debate. Firstly, some principal material on what the duty of the government is and why they should be focusing on current inequalities. Secondly, why compensation for historical injustices is always going to be ineffective and is unable to meet current needs. And thirdly, on how we spend on our side of the house, why that's so much better for everyone involved. Firstly, why the government has a principal duty to rectify the massive injustices that currently exist in our society. 3 reasons here. Firstly, we think that current injustices affect people living right now. They're the ones that the government has the biggest duty to help. They're the ones that are currently living within our society. They're also the ones who are facing the biggest harm because of these injustices. We think the government has the biggest ability to change the lives of these people by funding them through the support structures that we're going to implement. Secondly, these are the people we actually have the ability to help the most. These are the ones that are currently struggling, right? We sadly, historical injustices affect people that no longer exist within our society. They're long past. We are able to actually provide issues to people, to provide benefits to the people who are living now, provide benefits to the people who need them most. Thirdly, I think by rectifying current inequalities, we solve the flow-on effects of historical injustices more effectively than we would otherwise. So secondly then, on why the compensations provided as a form of historical reparation are always going to have issues. 2 reasons here. Firstly, we tell you that they're very short-term benefits and that by their nature, they can't address the long-term systemic issues. Why is this? 2 ways. Firstly, we just see that this is empirically true in our society, the way that we currently pay out to things like in things like the Treaty of Waikato reparations, generally cash payment. But secondly, we think it's really, really hard, if not impossible, to alter the physical outcome of these events that happened long in the past, right? Introduction of diseases into Aboriginal communities in Australia, right? That's something that we can't change, and because of this, we think the government has the only option for the government then is to solve this by doing things like cash payouts. Why is this so harmful? 2 reasons. Firstly, it ignores the need of social issues that have sprung up as an effect of inequalities and as an effect of the inequalities that occurred in the past, right? These effects have happened in all areas of life, not just economically, not just something that can be solved by a simple cash payment. This looks like historical, like hiring biases. This looks like people being pushed into poorer communities. We don't think these things are solved by a simple payout. Secondly, the government is now able to put blame on these groups for their future inequalities that after the reparations have been given. We think they're able to say sort of we made it up to them, where they are now faced with the burden of their own responsibility in terms of what they actually have to do to support themselves continually. We think that's really harmful in the long term. Secondly, and more importantly, we tell you that the needs of the groups have actually changed. And where it is possible to partially undo historical injustices, which is very uncommon, I think that this is totally unsuited to the sort of change that we actually need. For example, this is land, looks like land that's given back to Māori as part of Māori land court, right? We tell you that this is generally historically important locations, which tends to be rural areas. This is areas that were probably important 200 years ago for agricultural or rural reasons. not the sorts of areas that are actually going to benefit people living in the here and now. Māori need areas of housing in urban areas where they're actually able to engage with society. We on our side of the house do things like social housing to low income groups. This lifts them out of poverty, allows them to get jobs, allows them to engage in the society that we currently live in, allows them to gain public mobility. When the government pushes to give reparations, they're using ineffective systems that don't meet the modern needs of these communities. NEG in this debate stands for an ineffective system that doesn't help the people it claims to, and also doesn't remove support from the people who aren't classified under these historical injustices definitions. So secondly, on how we spend and why that's so much more effective. Because on our side of the house, we focus on the most important issues facing those suffering today. These are the people who are actually suffering, and this generally reflects the past inequalities. We think that this is actually going to be picking up those people who have faced past inequalities. So how do we change it in the long term for these individuals? Two ways. Firstly, on wealth and income inequality. We would focus on long-term transformative policy that actually allows to uplift these people, uplift these struggling individuals and families. Things like fairer taxation, things like raising the minimum wage to actually help the lowest earners in our society, ensuring that they have enough to live on, ensuring that they have enough to support their families. We also push for education, for offering things like scholarships to low-income families, pathways for families with intergenerational lack of access to education to allow them to deal with to allow them to re-engage in society, to allow them to make sure that they have high prospects going forward. Crucially, not only does this deal with historical issues, it also picks up on other groups that have slipped through the cracks for other reasons. This is like people with family violence issues, people with abuse, people who have been failed by society, who may be poor for a whole number of other reasons. We think that we're able to better deal with them. We're able to give them more support and lift them out of poverty in a more strong way when we focus all of our funding and effort on them. This is focusing on the future of these communities, right? The youth of these communities. This is what's actually going to create change in the long term, because youth need the ability to earn, raise their families out of poverty, we provide us with better education and the income inequality methods we also support. Secondly, we also support increasing their ability to be represented in society, because the current major inequality that is faced by a lot of communities is unequal representation, is unequal representation in things like parliament, in things like communities, and things like government. How do we solve this? Well, we spend more on things like the creation of things like Māori seats, campaigns to get Māori interested and involved in the election process, which gives them a far bigger stake in whether the elections are run, gives them a far bigger ability for them to have an active say in the way that the money is rolled out in the future, actually ensures that in the long term, things that their needs are being provided to. So by focusing on all inequality, not just the historical injustices, we're actually able to target funding directly to where it will have the biggest impact, right? Because the issues that currently face these communities, the issues that currently face these individuals, are dependent on the ways that society has changed over time. We think that this is really important that we're focusing on these sorts of issues. We're very, very proud to be the house that actually is able to spend effectively on these communities, that is able to spend effectively to ensure that they don't fall back into poverty.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the first speaker for the negating team to open their team's case.
key difference between current inequality and historical wrongs is the very governments who are acting in this debate today are directly responsible for those historical wrongs and not necessarily for current inequalities. We say that means they have a principal duty, irrespective of any of the practical material they wanted to bring, about improving, getting redress to these groups for this historical harm which these governments have perpetrated. Only opposition fulfills this duty. What's our stance in this debate today? Firstly, we just like to support things like the Waikato Tribunal, which focus more on these historical wrongs that apart from current inequality. We're going to have things like boards of historians and economists to assess the extent of this historical wrong, and then allocate these reparations, allocate these things proportionally. But what do we think these reparations look like? Sure, we're happy to stand for cash payments, as we've seen in the Waikato Tribunal, as we've seen get so many local iwi really empowered into business and tourism. We're also happy to stand for things like building really crucial infrastructure in these areas where these disaffected communities have historically been pushed into, and that is also able to get them that mobility. We still think that in some areas the government should consider inequality, but its primary focus should be on those historical wrongs. We're going to win this debate today by showing you how these historical injustices deserve to be addressed, and we best address those. 4 arguments. Firstly, on the principle about why the government have that duty. Secondly, about how we uniquely get public buy-in and how that actually means that we're going to be able to get this in the long term. Thirdly, how we better deal with structural issues facing these things. And Valentino will split to you on the nature of these packages and why they're so important on our side of the house. But before we get into the substantive material, just some rebuttal on that. We tell you that they told us that okay, people are going to think that just because you give African Americans money, they're going to forget about slavery. We tell you that there's always going to be that societal consciousness around slavery. People are never going to think that a sum of money is going to make it up. But what we do is we actually go halfway. We go there and we try and implement that. That's really important as well because we actually get that discourse about our history on our side of the house. They can't claim that they get all that discourse when the focus is only on the present. We can get that. Okay. Secondly, they want to tell us that their current inequality stuff is going to be long term. Firstly, we just know that this kind of isn't the type of thing addressing inequality that we see today. We see things like benefits being really important for addressing that inequality. But secondly, even if there isn't, we tell you that there's a lack of appetite for this big structural spending on their side because you're not able to weaponize the generations of oppression that we can in order to actually get that spending, get that. They wanted to tell us about appropriate. They wanted to tell us finally about multi-seats. We say it's we're perfectly happy to do this on our side of the house. In fact, we're probably more likely to get multi-seats than African American seats in the United States, to the point at which these groups are uniquely targeted, where you're not going to have Latino seats as well, or Pacific seats to the same degree. We're able to correct those historical injustices of no representation. Firstly, on this principle, our governments did these wrongs and they have a duty to correct it. The starting point for this is that the government did these or actively benefited from this for reasons. One, we just point to things like history through processes of slavery, colonization, all of those things. That's how these governments actually come to power. That's how they've entrenched themselves. They really actively benefit here. Secondly, we just tell you that these power structures in and of themselves are oppressive, and that when it's not sure, it doesn't have to be you actively going and enslaving people, but it's things like negligence. It's things that still means that benefits happen. Okay. Now starting off, so what this necessarily means, because the government did that, they have that principle obligation. They wanted to tell us that the governments are best able to do that. We tell you, the governments have failed these people before. These people actually need the opportunity to have that economic and social agency to actually get those changes. Only we are able to give them to them. What's the comparative thing? It's important to note that current inequality is not necessarily perpetuated by government. It's things like arbitrary factors, geographical location and industries what led to a lot of this inequality, and that's not necessarily the government's doing. Secondly, we just point to things like immigration. So poorer immigrants coming in from other countries searching for a better life. These governments can't roll these, they don't have that principal obligation for them in the same way that they do to these disaffected groups. What are the outcomes of this? 2 things. Firstly, we just tell you that they have the duty to do that, and that because they've benefited from that oppression. As an actor, that's the first thing you should always be fulfilling. There should be fulfilling the stuff they've done wrong in the past, rather than like looking at issues that other people have caused. Not chances are independent of consideration of actually how effective this aim is, because like they have this duty, they should like fulfill it. But second outcome here is that the government is less likely to do like more wrongdoings in the future because they know they have like an actual incentive to like stop when like they will have to pay out for it in the future. Okay. On this second idea about public buy-in, the starting point for this is that you need that public buy-in for the policies to work. Firstly, there's like perception, day-to-day interactions with public minorities, bodies historically oppressed groups go. It's really important. Secondly, we just tell you that like governments, when governments aren't in power, they're not able to, like when small different governments aren't in power, they're not able to implement these policies at all. So the therefore the comparative doesn't necessarily become between inequality and like historical wrongs. It becomes historical wrongs and other things. Okay. And finally, we just tell you that like this consistency is really important and allows for aid to be distributed on a wide scale. Why do we only get public buy-in on our side of the house? A number of reasons. First, we tell you that historical wrongs are really well documented and widely accepted. That means that people are going to be accepting of this like need of this duty we have to give these people reparations. But secondly, on the comparative, we tell you that a lot of like Americans, especially like the old white soccer mom in like Iowa, like doesn't necessarily believe in things like current systemic racism. She's not going to believe in like things. She's going to believe about like slavery, but she's not going to believe about like current inequality that's so important on their side of the house. Thirdly, we just tell you that there's less of a personal attack at the point at which you tell people, like, okay, your ancestors done some bad stuff, now you need to pay. Rather than you are like uncontrovertibly racist, and now you need to like pay your hard-earned taxpayer dollars like about that. That's really important because it means that you don't get this adversarial relationship that's really going to damage. So, okay, what are the outcomes of this? Firstly, just on a political and economic level, we were able to get things like more spending over a long period of time. And that's really important because you get things like consistency, which is so vital in these policies. But secondly, on the day-to-day level, we just improve the perception of these minorities. That's really important because they're like less and suffer of things like microaggressions. Now, finally, on how we best deal with structural issues. The starting point of this is that inequality doesn't like this. Their policies can like deal with these structural barriers because necessarily reactionary to what's happening right now and not like looking into the future, and then it tends to be short term. Why do we get better structural stuff? We just tell you that like you're giving these people agency. That's so important because that looks like iwi in New Zealand starting tourism businesses, investing and actually giving back to these people. You don't get that on this side of the house when you just have like a government bureaucrat in Wellington saying, I know better than you because like I've oppressed you so long. Secondly, we just try to feel like they're able to deal with these specific issues, like facing these people. Because you have that full picture of that historical context. They're only able to like have the snapshot of immediately now. You're not able to get that long-term stuff. What's the outcomes of this? That structure allowing to uplift themselves, to uplift their communities we oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the second speaker of the affirmative team to continue the case for Waikato.
Panel, if you're a disadvantaged minority who lives in a poorly insulated home, unable to afford enough food, living on minimum wage, and unable to give your kids the opportunity to get an education capable of placing them on a different path, the government addressing an issue from 150 years ago isn't going to help you one single bit. Throughout this debate, we've consistently been the team that actually stood for making change where it matters now, for actually making change to the people we're thus suffering now. All right, in this debate, I'm going to bring you to firstly 2 points of rebuttal centering on 2 major points of contention, and in a split point about how this crucially improves public favour for addressing inequalities. First, I'm going to begin with some rebuttal around 2 major points of contention. Firstly, on the principal contention about the impact of that the government should have. The primary thing that a side negating wanted to tell you about here was that the government would have this kind of like principal duty, right, to like amend its historical wrongdoings. We have three responses to this. Firstly, we tell you that like we don't inherently disagree that the government should amend its wrongdoings, but at the same time, current inequalities are also a wrongdoing, right? And we clarified to you many times at first why the wrongdoings that are presented currently are a far larger one. Secondly, though, the government today is also responsible for many current inequalities, right? But the makeup of the government has changed since the time those historical inequalities occurred. It's the current government that should look at the current inequalities. Those are the things that we should be doing in our society. Thirdly, though, we heard that also like the nature of this wrongdoing has changed as also, right? Like the wrongdoings that we principally could have addressed 150 years ago are actually quite different from the wrongdoings that are taking place today, right? Like 100 years of evolution has meant that many of the structural issues are now different, are now adapted to the modern age, and the government should be working on fixing those issues principally before looking the other direction. Look, crucially though, we tell you that like even if the other team can prove some principal benefits somehow, we tell you that just overall these principled outcomes are less important, right? People care fundamentally more about the practical benefits. The practical benefits are more important at the point at which people are literally suffering, are literally unable to get the education, the support they need in today's society because of the suffering. That is far more important. Lastly on this, we should point out that they failed critically to engage with the principle we also brought up at first about how we need to give the best benefits to the people who are suffering. Now a lot more work needs to be done from their side of the house in order to actually win this point if it holds any weight at all. Okay, let's move on then to the impact on justice groups, because this is where we think a lot of the benefits in our side really become clear. We were very clear here that injustice groups in our society are the ones that are most benefited by our side of the house, and the main contentions we heard here surrounded two main areas. Firstly, they told us that their side of the house would also solve the structural issues facing our society. Look, this was a major issue that they needed to address in this debate, and it was not enough for them to just bring it up 7 minutes 30 into their first speech, okay? Just saying that they're going to like uplift like communities, etc., and like maybe solve their structural issues isn't enough, right? We gave you multiple mechanisms at first as to why we solve the issues that are facing people today. We provide better education programs. We put funding into things like actually building homes, education, healthcare, and social services for these people where it matters. That's a crucial point of how we get better outcomes. That's something they never addressed so far. A lot more work needs to be done here. The other thing they really kind of wanted to talk about was about discourse, how solving historical injustices would allow more opportunities for change. Look, frankly, this was pretty ridiculous. 3 responses. First, we tell you that like it's just not true, right? That people are going to see these historical reparations taking place and then want to give in to more reparations, right? We see it's far more likely that people are just going to wave it away because you've already done these things, right? People generally, if it doesn't matter to them, people want to do the bare minimum possible.
Pause. There's a button on there.
Which one?
One side.
Squeeze that.
It's small.
It's a small one. Quick start. Well, if we want to do it. Alright.
You handle the type 2 getting practical
In regards to like the whole discourse of change thing, we kind of like it's just not true because more people will wave it away just because of like these historical reparations have already taken place. We certainly don't really like consider all that much issues that don't make it live. And the point where there's already like that political capital used to say, oh, we made these historical reparations. Now the public's just far less likely, right, to consider making even further shifts towards even further change. Secondly, though, we turn out like the inequalities we see today, which I'm going to cover in my split, are actually matter far more because those are things we see today, right? You actually see like social media stories and people around you of like these certain groups suffering in the current world. Those are seen far more, those are publicized far more. And we actually see that those things actually lead, so those things actually lead to far more discourse for change. Lastly, we just have like the general population doesn't really know that much about historical wrongs. It's just incorrect to say that like everyone around us cares lots and lots and lots about issues from 150 years ago. Unless you're a debater or a history student, you're really not actually going to know all that much. Okay, Lastly here though, let's just quickly look at the comparative. Our side of the house is one that crucially supports people where it actually matters, solving the issues that matter in the current day, providing education, healthcare, and social programs to address those issues. We win at this stage because we've given you so many reasons at first why those things actually matter and how we help people in those areas. None of those things were crucially responded to by their team's case. In order to bring it back, they'll need to do a lot of work. All right, let's move on then to our split point about how we address improved public favour for addressing inequality. Notice this also contradicts clashes with a lot of the stuff that their team brought you at first. The problem here is that to properly get good rectification of injustice and therefore widespread social change, we must also maximize public interest understanding. I think both teams would agree that this is very, very important. Addressing the current issues first helps us in two ways. First, it ensures that others aren't pushed away, right? Because with historically focused reparations, oftentimes they don't consider the present, right? We give back, like for example, if we give back land that's currently owned by someone else, we just create kind of antagonism towards solving these historical wrongs. But secondly, other methods tend to appear like building memorials or like giving out cash payments, tends to appear somewhat like fluffy, right, and useless. It reduces public desire to spend on these things. And I flagged this earlier in my rebuttal. This is crucially important because it uses up critical political capital, critical public favour that could otherwise be spent on solving actual inequalities. Secondly, though, we take that this solving current issues is much more favourable towards younger people, right? Because for younger populations, minority or otherwise, there's not that much support for addressing historical issues that they haven't experienced. They want their issues addressed. They want to make sure that they can get an education, that they can get support in their future. And look, if a 17-year-old from a minority community, they'd probably rather like each spending on building better education and scholarship outcomes for them than buying a quick solution to their granddad's issues from 100 years ago, right? Our first speaker highlighted this, and this is crucially something that's important to remember throughout this debate. As young people are so important, both in the short term, because they are of their impact on the media and setting of trends, but also in the long term, because they'll grow up to be members of our government and they need that long term goodwill. Making sure that young people are aided by this policy is incredibly helpful in ensuring that we get long-term societal change towards helping solve inequalities. Look, at the end of this debate, what this looks like is our world is a world in which we help the people where it matters, we ensure that long-term change actually occurs, and we make sure that we're standing for injustice where it matters most. Their team has done none of that. They lost today's debate.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the second speaker of the negating team to continue the case for Auckland-wide.
What the SI needed to give to you today was a model that differentiated itself from our current reality, right? A current reality where we do see all these injustices, right? Where we do have free education, but we still see all these issues still pervading towards the communities, right? A model that actually told us how they fix inequality, especially when this debate revolves highly around like the racial issues that individuals face, right? What they said came up and gave us instead was just a model that essentially repeated what already exists within our current situation. Also one that was extremely untargeted, right? One that just dropped money to like wider society and not actually dealt with the most vulnerable actors within this society. So what do we think matters in this debate? So I'll come up with two major issues and I'll give you my split, right? So first of all, which side improves the situation for these individuals? Second of all, which side gets the political pressure for all these policies to actually pass? And last of all, I'll discuss in my split why our packages are ultimately more holistic when we do pass them, right? So which side actually improves the situation for these individuals? Realize that we've already told you from first that what we do is not solely getting our money, right? We believe that as part of compensation for past policies, accounts for policies that have limited individuals like African Americans from getting to schools, right? Things of that nature, right? We think that to that extent, we have given you to argumentation regarding things like infrastructure, right? Like building roads for communities that are unable to access other things. We've told you about why the Waikato tribunal works, right? And how we can give money to things like needy communities, right? What they said about this, right? They said that this was all ineffective because apparently everyone hates it and like, actually they never really told us why that is useless, right? All they just tell us is that social policy is just objectively better, and we tell you that we don't think social policy does suddenly disappear, right? It's not the only solution in this debate. It's not like why we should be reallocated to dealing with individuals who were racially disadvantaged in the past, right? And that's what they have to contend with, rather than contending with this false case that they want to talk about, right? So let's go into which side actually gets political pressure. And I believe that this is one of the most essential parts of this debate, because the side that actually compensates actually gets their policy passed, right? Because we have told you from first that it's a lot easier to justify to the individuals when you have a Waikato tribunal, when you are actively looking into the history, why these individuals actually need aid, right? And while they've come up with like broad policies like education that don't specifically help anyone, right? Or like don't specifically help these disadvantaged individuals, we tell you what else it actually does. What we think the problem comparative is that what the SI has to defend is a situation in which they have to solve the inequalities of these individuals through specifically aiding them like in their current inequality, right?
We've given you several reasons how spending on education and other affairs would help solve inequalities by opening new opportunities. Please engage with us and tell us why you think that won't occur.
Well, we already told you that spending on education does exist under the status quo. We don't see why that suddenly disappears. But even if you believe that more spending on education suddenly does help things, this goes on. We just think that individuals in specific circumstances need to be accounted for, right? Like we think that your rural farmer who has to work the whole day to keep his family fed is not able to access like this. And we think that your rural farmer who has to work the whole day to keep his family fed is not able to access like this education that you want to talk about, right? And I'll go on to that later that you want to talk about, right? And I'll go on to that later in my holistic packages split. But we just think that there are like wider circumstances that historically entrench people into these positions, right? So going back to the political pressure, right? We never really hear from them any comeback on this, right? We told you that we actually create a situation where we didn't hear from them any comeback on this, right? We told you that we actually create a situation where, at the bare minimum, if both sides have to assume that we get, at the bare minimum, if both sides have to assume that we get some sort of policy, we at the bare minimum allow for more spending, right? Where the public is actually more willing to allow the government to spend these sorts of things when they feel that there is like some sort of past guilt when they're not actively playing, right? If their side is going to come up and say that they solve all inequality and everyone's going to be like willing to spend on these things, we think that like first of all that just simply isn't true. But also second of all, they never gave us any proper reasoning as to why the public suddenly accept these things on their side, right? Especially when the people being taxed are like the richer, right? We told you why we did on our side. So last, also they give us this weird response about people not knowing about historical wrongs, except that, it constantly appears in education, and it constantly appears throughout our media, it constantly appears throughout our social lives, right? We think slavery is a major issue that's constantly talked about. We think that the Treaty of Waikato is something that's majorly talked about throughout our lives, right? So we think that none of this is really relevant, right? So lastly, onto this thing. Why do we think our package is just more holistic and therefore like subjectively better? Realize that in Malaysia, when the Malays were moved into the cities through when the Chinese were moved into cities through colonization, and the Malays were moved out to rural areas, there's this sort of systemic issue that we want to solve, right? What they got instead was immediate affirmative action from the government. And what this did was created a situation where all these individuals who could not move out of their farms still are disadvantaged to this very day, right? We don't think that the 10% of housing and the discounts and the food stamps that they get actually did anything, right? We think that there are further underlying issues that have to be analyzed, right? Which is why we propose that under our world, we would have an historical board and we would have economists view these things, right? Because only when you look into the underlying source of all these wrongdoings, of all these issues, we think that's when you actually have a solution to this policy, right? To do these issues, right? And realize that this is not a debate set in one country, right? We think you have to account for all the countries across the world and they can't just say that education and like some benefits suddenly helps everyone across the world, right? We think that you have to actually account and have a holistic policy that comes with the problems that happen with each and every minority, that have occurred for each and every situation that's occurred globally, right? We think that only occurs on the outside. When you account for the past, when you account for geographic situation, when you account for economic situation. These are the kinds of things that occur, right? So what we think actually occurs on the outside is a holistic package, right? What do we think this looks like? This looks like for rural farmers like we were talking about. We think it looks like capital machinery being given to them so that they have just a better process and better ability to socially uplift themselves. We think this looks like access for these individuals to move into cities, right? But we also think that as much as they want to bash on like giving out money to individuals, we think that's absolutely valid, right? We think that if we give enough money for these individuals to be able to move into cities, we give enough individuals money to these individuals so that they have leeway to get education, so that they don't have to like spend their entire day working to feed their family. We think that those are absolutely valid situations, right? We think that in these sorts of scenarios, we don't see why a holistic package doesn't work. Like, do you want to go through?
Why would a government want to like spend money doing these things when they can actually help like their own people?
Can you repeat the last one?
Why would a government want to spend money helping previous things when they can actually get more public favor by helping things directly?
Well, first of all, we think that so first of all, social programs like this, we think they carry enough public favor for that. Second of all, we don't think funding public programs even more means they can suddenly get exponential amounts more public favor, right? We think the people are just like generally happy. We think that when you help a certain minority base, that's when your voter base growth comes towards you, and that's where you get like all the political power that you do on the outside, right? We don't see why like broad brushstrokes change, but also we think that like specified policy is just more appealing and something that can be specific to political parties, right? So closing in on this, what do we think workforce look like? We've shown you a world wherein we have historical accounts and we look into the specific structural issues that keep people out of social mobility. What the SI provides to you is broad brushstrokes that don't actually account for issues individuals face and the inaccessibility of things like social welfare. They want to rely on things like community. They want to rely on favoring social programs that exist in the status quo. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the third speaker from the affirmative team to finish the substantive case for the Waikato.
The opposing team lost today's debate when, after that second speech bashing our own model, they chose to support vague statements about constructing infrastructure or providing short-term cash reparations through the Treaty of Waitangi settlements. If we're going to be talking about the ineffectiveness of models in this debate, look at team negating and look at the short-term impacts and the inability to engage with the current issues that are facing our minority groups in society. Our team is the only team that's provided an effective characterization right from the first half that is engaging with the issues, engaging with future issues that will affect these minority groups. So 2 points of clash today. Firstly, is the government directly responsible for correcting historical wrongs, and where is the principle in this debate? And secondly, what is the actual impact of these policies on these groups? Does it generate public buy-in? Is it an effective way to generate change? So firstly, let's talk about the principle. We have 5 responses to the case that's brought by the opposing team. Firstly, the government is also going to be personally responsible and they have a duty to fix the current inequalities that exist in their country. Because of the policies that they have implemented, they are directly responsible for the way in which the impacts that creates and the internal biases and prejudices that impact the government today. There is also a duty that is even more important, acting on these groups. Secondly, we still fulfill the duty acting on the government because the groups that have been historically wronged in the past are the same groups that are currently being wronged by current inequality. Robert told you that these issues are linked and that they stem from each other, so that even if we need to help historically wronged groups, by focusing on current inequalities, we also provide a compensation for these minority groups. Thirdly, the government has a stronger duty to the people who are suffering today and who are actually alive today. I will give you structural reasons about why our principal duty is stronger, telling me that this group is more vulnerable because it impacts all of New Zealand, and not just minority groups that have been historically wronged, but people who are suffering from family violence, drug abuse, and also need social support and welfare. We have a much wider scale of impact, and thus that enhances our duty. Secondly, it's really difficult to actually resolve historical injustice, like Robert said, that is not properly responded to by the opposing team. The best that you can do is offer reparations and cash settlements. The opposing team is willing to support, because wars fought in the past can't be reversed. Historical decisions can't be reversed. Fourthly, let's say that the government 300 years ago may have been directly responsible for historic injustices, but the government today, the government that's in power today, the leadership that we have in the modern world, that same duty does not apply, because they should not be held responsible for the mistakes and wrongs committed by their predecessors and by their past. We support acknowledging historical wrongs. We support issuing an apology or statements of historical wrongs, without linking that to spending, but the current leadership does not have a duty to fix the past mistakes. Lastly, the principle in this debate alone is not enough for debating to win. If anything, we have an equal or better principle on our side of the house, because we are both protecting the same minority groups, and actually we're protecting more minority groups besides historical wrongs to impact all the vulnerable groups across New Zealand. They have to prove that short-term cash reparations are actually benefiting these groups in order to satisfy this principal duty. So ultimately, this is contingent on the greater point of clash, that is, what is the actual impact on these policies? So let's discuss this. What is the actual impact on these groups? Where does the comparative analysis lie on the two different opposing models that both teams have presented? Firstly, I'd like to talk about generating public buy-in and public support for these policies. We have 4 responses to the case brought by the opposing team. Firstly, Andrew told you in his split point that correcting historical wrongs largely means taking something away from, be it land, be it money, from another group that currently exists in society, because you have to take the land that was historically held, that was historically important 200 years ago, and that is largely controlled by people living currently in society. This will naturally create public opposition to any policy that the government is putting forth, because existing groups, largely predominantly white, or like the colonial settlers that came into this country, largely control the resources in society. They control land settlements that are being negotiated. So firstly, they're going to speak out in media and directly oppose the government's options. But secondly, and more importantly, they're going to be directly resentment towards these minority groups who are living in these communities, who are benefiting from the compensation, because something's been taken away from them and given to that group. This brings about racial hate and prejudice, so that when a Māori family moves into their new house, given to them by a treaty of settlement negotiation, the land that was restored to them, they now get rejected by this community, or are actively harmed by the people living in this community, because you have created so much resentment and xenophobia on the opposing side. Secondly, our policy best generates public buy-in for young people, because the opposing government on their side of the house seems outdated, out of touch, not like they're not dealing with the current issues they're actually facing the current generation living today. Youth care about the inequality that faces them today. They care about their lack of education, their employment prospects, their lacking representation in government and political capital. We are the ones who connect to this youth by creating an engaged government that drives with the issues that are faced in society today. They're the most important group to connect with public buy-in, because this is the current generation. They will be the youth that live into the future, 20, 30 years from now. Our case is engaging with the future world with 20 years down the line. Thirdly, current inequality today is actually really visible and can be seen in society. So the government is able to point to specific stats and figures and data to be able to prove that this spending is necessary to help real people. Largely for historical issues, a large majority of the general populace don't remember history very well. They haven't really paid attention in schools. They don't really care about historical wrongs. It hasn't directly affected them. When they can see people living on the street homeless, they can see people struggling with poverty actually today, they're more likely to feel empathetic, more likely to feel empathy and care for those people, and they're more likely to be willingly contributing their tax dollars to help fund this government spending.
Lastly, if these citizens do not buy into current inequality already, then they're probably not going to be buying into historical wrongs. We heard that example from, I think, the second speaker. But if like a far-right government, if a far-right supporter is against government welfare support, they're also going to be against government welfare support detailed historical wrongs. So there's no real difference on that line of analysis. Lastly, let's talk about the way in which we heard effective change from there. It was a vague assertive statement around building infrastructure, or more realistically, what we think we're going to be doing, providing short-term cash flows. Robert gave you structural reasons why this is really harmful, so let's quickly recap those. Firstly, it shifts blame from the government onto minority groups, saying we gave them all this cash with no strings attached, now it's their fault that they're still poor. This does not address the systemic barriers in society, the actual current inequalities that are facing them. Just giving them a cash payout with no strings attached doesn't actually help them. Lots of the issues that still, the discrimination and prejudice that still acts against these minority groups. Secondly, it's only a short-term fix to the problem. Sure, there may be like some vague infrastructure spending, but on our side of the house, we give you specific policies like looking towards the future, funding education pathways, tertiary education pathways, solving wealth inequality by creating housing in urban development areas rather than rural farming community areas that were historically important 20 years ago. We actually create a long-term fix to the problem. Lastly, like the example of affirmative action, the easy way out that the government is taking, that's exactly the harmful sort of policy that's going to be impacted on the opposing side of the house. The government is going to be taking this easy way out, and the government is not going to be addressing the real harms and the real issues that are facing these groups.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the third speaker from the negating team to conclude the substantive portion of today's debate.
And today has presented you with an idealistic but short-sighted case that doesn't accurately tackle what issues on both sides and what implementations and actions are actually mutually exclusive on either side, and that is how we are going to win today's debate. 3 questions for you. This is how we're going to win today's debate. Firstly, we're going to talk about the principle and how we can win on the principle alone. Secondly, we're going to tell you about how we're going to get into principle buy-in and why this is like the most important point in today's debate. And finally, we're going to be telling you about like what actions are actually going to be taken on both sides and the tangible impacts that result on our side as a result of that. So quickly onto the principal point, which is regarding to whom does the government have the greatest duty to. So we've heard a lot of like back and forth on this principal point, right? We told you right now from first that like the current inequalities weren't all caused by the government, right? And this is why the government has like more of a principal duty towards like inequalities that were injustices that were like done in the past because they were directly responsible for them. We heard like some sort of like responses from the authority. They told you firstly that like current inequalities are also wrongly on the governments. But this directly contradicts material brought forth by their first speaker when they told us that some of their focus would also be on like people with family issues, like domestic violence, or like people who weren't historically wrong, right? They tried to tell you some of these benefits. They can't have it both ways. These things don't exist on the time. We actually tackle the things that the government was directly responsible for. They told us also that like because the current government is different from the government, it will be ameliorated of the duty that they have towards the people that they have helped. We think that this is false because our principal duty is towards like making things better for all of these people that they have helped, right? And for like continuity and treating like the government as a consistent body so that the government is able to like lead to consistent outcomes for these people is incredibly important. And for these later companies people and us, critically important. They finally told you that like they would be able to like protect more minority groups, and that's why they have critically wanted to make. Firstly, like this is and secondly, it's dependent on the minority groups actually being like a group that the government hasn't like historically done. We think that the principle has like all tensions in that we have won the principle in today's debate. But more importantly, also the actual practical material in today's debate, right? So firstly, how do we get better political buy-in? There are like two main questions under this word clash. Firstly, on that of like obscurity versus knowledge, how much knowledge do people have of like the different issues on either side? And finally, in terms of like attitudes, right? How are people likely to emotionally respond to these things? How much political burden they're likely to contribute to it. So in terms of obscurity, I've tried to like ask many questions as well as to tell us if like nobody knows about historical injustices because apparently like everybody is like pretty uneducated. We think that this is pretty false. Like firstly intuitively because we're like an increasingly globalized and digitalized society. We think that people have like a lot of information accessible to them about all these things. But three more mechanisms as to why people actually know about historical injustices. Firstly, like it's taught at schools, right? Like when a nation has committed historical injustices, such as like when we did not honor the treaty of Waikato, we think that this stuff is like nationally important and put into the primary school level national curriculum. We think that even right from primary people are taught about these things. Secondly, like historians, academics, and journalists are able to like get crucial information on all of these problems and feed it to the public, right? Why is there more knowledge from historians on our side? Firstly, because they have to gain the retrospect. Because these injustices have happened in the past, historians are able to like access memoirs or like memorials that aren't like currently accessible in the present day. They have like way more critical information about these things. And secondly, because like the people with like this information that is really important to academics don't have are like more removed from the situation and like they don't have incentive to cover up information. For example, like we know about the egregious acts that Malaysia had like that had taken place in Malaysia, but we don't know about the full extent of things that happen in like China or Russia or North Korea today because they're still happening, which means that people don't know about it. This is crucial because it's uniquely different on both sides. They have way less information about things that happen under the current status quo. And finally about social media, like as first speaker already talked like more about social media, right? I think it's important. It literally pushes misinformation in people's faces. People know about historical injustices. In terms of attitudes in that case. So activists argue that like the government wants to be in the favor by people who can vote now. So like firstly, like if the government is pushing for affirmative action in any capacity, we think that they're probably like perceived as like fairly liberal. We think that therefore like the liberal or leftist demographic is probably already on the people if they don't need to hear about the current population. Who they do need to appeal to is like conservatives and moderates, right? So we think that like on our side, we already gave you like tons and tons of material, really good stuff at live. We already like told you about why like antagonism is going to group. When people try to like take away money from like people's private in order to like tax current right? We told you that like by telling people they were responsible for all of these like terrible things in the world, it was likely to like brew antagonism because people don't like admitting to those. It's like that we try to get on our side is not relatable to like conservatives and moderates who place this critical importance on like the economy, right? Or like working in business and stuff. And not even things like rerouting housing or like stealing educational opportunities as they would see it, which the government to start to offer. We think that moderates and conservatives are way more likely to buy into our claims and stuff about like improving the infrastructure of communities and all of these things that are really good for housing. Outcomes, we get like more nature policies passed in the future. This means this has like an exponential effect because like having like nature policies passed in the future means that we impact people way more on that side, but also like we just get better social treatment as well because like the reduced resentment from like moderates and conservatives in the population means that even socially, like people who have been wronged in the past, the people who have had these injustices done towards them are going to be treated better. This is the most important point because of the shared stakeholder, because of the long-term stuff, right? We think that these social attitudes last far longer than a few lifetimes of minimally decent well that happens on the opposite side. We think that we win on this point alone. In terms of what actions are being taken on both sides, two categories here: things that are the same on both sides, things that are not the same on both sides. I've tried to like push like social housing to vulnerable groups, right? Firstly, like this is the metric we get it because one, we still have like some expenditure on like resolving current inequalities, but secondly, like we get like social housing is also a direct like reparative restoration for robbing people of their lands and their homes. We think we still get things like social housing. They talked about like molding states as well. We think that like even maybe like 2 more states occupied by molding people in Parliament is like going to make a difference. But we think because like they still need to convince all of those like other people to like pass more states, right? But we think that changing the social attitudes, like I outlined in my first one, is going to make a difference in terms of what policies are being passed. In terms of things that are the same on both sides. Actually, it is like they get like marginally more education, but this doesn't like really contribute to any meaningful tangible outcomes because the largest barriers that disenfranchised people face today aren't whether or not they can get accepted into universities, but whether or not they have the economic support from their families, whether or not their families are able to like pay their bills because they've been like struggling in like rural farms, whether or not they're like feeling tired constantly at university. Outside actually fixes all of these things because we improve the families' communities, we improve the situations in which they grow up. All of these things are incredibly important, and because we provide them, we are a side that has much better today.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and as is customary, I'll reverse the speaking order and invite up the reply speaker for the affirmative, for the negating team to conclude the debate.
It was never going to be good enough in today's debate for affirming to ask the Māori and African American people to be content with some broad, like brush educational policy from a government. From that same government who was responsible for their colonization, from that same government who was responsible for their enslavement, for that same government who's shown themselves time and time again to be incapable of acting in their best interests. We say that like give these people the opportunity to uplift themselves in this debate, give them a side with opposition. 3 ideas. Firstly, on the principle, secondly, on public buy-in, thirdly, on the nature of policy. The principle here, we've told you down the line, like systemic reasons for why governments are in power and how that really they trade off that oppression of these like marginalized communities in history. Like they wanted to like hit back at this and say that like, oh, it's like different people. We say that's still utterly incommensurable because the only reason they're actually there in like at all, and then the only reason that it is that the US is so wealthy is because of processes such as slavery, like because of these historical injustices. They also want to tell us about this duty to the people we have in the present. We just contest these like the scale of the harm here, not how it's so different. Like having a little bit of like neoliberal economic policies is never going to be able to weigh up against 200 years of slavery. That's not comparable in today's day. But secondly, we just tell you that there's more global forces acting now, so these governments are not necessarily directly responsible for this. Okay. So they want to also just finally here, we just like to note, these governments still are able to have policies that impact people on the people in the past. Focus on the harm that we can address. Okay. What does this mean in this debate today? At our best, we can win the principle alone, but at their best, we show that there's a main duty for the people who have been harmed in the past for those respective communities. That's the metric for what you should be judging this debate on. Okay. Now on to firstly on public buy-in. We just tell you that it's a lot easier to get that buy-in when that harm is really, really documented, as it has been through things like slavery. They want to tell us people don't know about slavery. Come on. There's a social consciousness. They're going to have this, they go through schools, they go through education. But even if you buy that material, we just tell you that the point at which you have these commissions, when you address these historical wrongs, that's how you get discussion about slavery, rather than just spending some more money for people being in classrooms that they wanted to tell was so ineffective. Secondly, they told us that there's going to be backlash from conservatives because people want their land. We just tell you that taxation to achieve their policy is equally not appealing for conservatives. That's the same on both sides. But crucially here, there's a sudden antagonism which is set up when you're told that you're like racist right now, and that's like why we need to like give this inequality. We like don't get that on our side, it's more palatable. You're going to be able to get that to the client. It's really important if you're able to like get that more spending, it's consistent and it's over a long period of time. Finally, here on the nature of policies. It's critical to note that on their side of the house, they necessarily have to target all people of low socioeconomic status. That means you don't get like tailored policies towards things like low people. That's really harmful. But secondly here, we necessarily give these people like the agency. Like when you give them like the capital like goods and the infrastructure to be able to like actually be able to like farm better in the way they happen, when you give them those like funds so they can start their tourist businesses. Like we think it's incredibly naive for Waikato to come up and tell us that like these are short-term cash payments when like iwi projects, which they have billions of dollars of industries, which employ so many more people, which benefit so many other people in society. It's not a short-term cash payment, it's a structural reason why they can actually benefit themselves, uplift themselves. Side with opposition.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and to conclude today's debate, I welcome up the affirmative leader.
When faced with our strong material about how we improve the outcomes for all marginalised people, not just those historically wronged or historically the subject of historical injustices, but people who are marginalised throughout society today, they provided a case that was woefully inefficient, woefully ineffective at providing any real tangible benefits to these people. We won on 3 counts today. First, principally, we showed that the government has a greater duty to provide to all citizens. Secondly, we show that we get far increased quantity of funding through better public buy-in. And thirdly, we get far better quality of funding. Our spending is much more effective, actually improves the lives of people that we need to be focusing on. Firstly, principally, I'll just quickly touch on this. The government makes, we told you, the government makes inequalities better for both people who have been historically wrong because of the flow effect and those who are in poverty for various different reasons. This means our scale of our benefits far larger. We're improving the lives of these people. We also told you that the government has a bigger duty to help these people now because they are the leadership of the government in this case. They don't have that same social responsibility to account for inequalities in the past. Secondly, then, on the quantity of funding, this was the public buy-in point. We have a team that actually gets far more spending, far more buy-in from the public that's actually able to spend that on people who need it. What was the response here? Well, they told us that the cash payments are fine, they're going to be able to give the same levels of funding through things like cash payments. We told you that this results in really harmful outcomes, things like blame shifting, things like short-term gains. When the government's able to say, well, we helped you, you don't have to do anything anymore. They claimed that this was a choice that minorities were getting, a choice that these historical people were getting. We actually see that the government is forcing these things onto them. These are solutions that do not give them agency, that take away the ability for them to actually dictate how they live their lives. We have real structural reasons about how we're actually going to solve wealth inequality. We're going to be doing things like building urban housing, building social housing that's actually affordable, no matter the situation you're coming from. When they claim that housing and aid is symmetric, it was totally untrue. We worked their house, it was able to actually prove we're going to get much better outcomes in terms of housing. We also had strong material around education, around scholarships and strong pathways, right? It was not enough for them to say, oh, the communities they're coming from are better, without any real mechanisms about how they're going to support these communities, right? We support these communities all the way through, both from their housing, making sure that they're able to actually support themselves, putting them in areas where they're able to actually get jobs, giving them grants, and then making sure their children are actually engaged. They're the ones that continue on. We get a long-term change that is needed to win this debate. We've also provided a policy that can only occur with capital and buy-in that we get on our side of the house, things like raising minimum wage, things like loans and grants for social housing, welfare, transfer payment. These are broadly impacting much larger groups than the small groups that they were talking about on their side of the house. We get much larger scale of impact, and we get impacts that only can occur on our side of the house with that great public buy-in of stopping things like reparations. We think that's really important. That's something that they can never find is symmetric on both sides. Lastly, then on the quality of funding, where this money is actually going. Because what we said here is that we said that creating historical wrongs creates antagonism from the majority. There's a feeling of resentment that you take when you're taking away assets, as you often do in reparations. We also said there was a far greater buy-in for young people, which was unresponded and it was unresponded to their whole mind. This is providing for the future, making sure that young people are still interested in what happens in the future. We also hear that current issues are far more physical than actually historical issues. People see people on the streets, people seeing homeless people, like the homeless people around you is far more interesting than people that you read about in the history book. People are far more interested, far more willing to spend, far more when it impacts people that they know. We also see that homelessness currently, the issues of inequality are far more documented through things like study, through things like information, than the sorts of historical issues that they were talking about. Very, very proud to be the team that creates funding for the people who need it most.
I'd like to thank all speakers for their speeches. I invite you to wave at each other or something. Well done and a great debate.